Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health webinar series. And thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about caring for young caregivers. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Participants are on mute while we are on the call, so you are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions or anything that you need to raise, there is a question function on the menu. So if you type that up, we'll take that up. Questions, we're going to start taking them up around, I would say 145, 140 or so. However, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them using the question function. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website, and the slides are also available to download now if you click under the handout function. We do have a short survey at the end of the webinar, so please take a few minutes to complete it as the feedback is very valuable to us. Now I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Perlin Ng. I am the Research and Knowledge Exchange Coordinator for the Center, and we are joined today by Andrea Breen and Michaela Miller. Thank you for joining us today. And now I'm just going to turn it over to you guys.
Great, thanks very much. So Michaela and I have decided to combine our slides for this. So I'm going to start off by speaking, and then Michaela's going to speak, and then we'll both be speaking. So I may need to tell Michaela when to advance the slides. But I'll start off just by introducing myself. My name is Andrea Breen. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Family Relations and Applied Nutrition at the University of Guelph. And my research focuses on a few different things, but one key area is young caregivers. I got interested in this area a very long time ago when I was working in children's mental health, and noticed that some of the young people in our programs were performing kind of secret work that we didn't know about, that no one was asking about, where they were in fact supporting family members, particularly parents with mental health needs. And then here, fast forward several years, as a professor at the University of Guelph, in a department where we have a lot of young people who are pursuing careers related to social work, teaching, other care-oriented professions, I noticed that a lot of our students also provide care for family members. So I got very interested in this, and now it's an area of research for me. So that's where I'll be basing my, my speaking from. Michaela, do you want to maybe introduce yourself now just briefly so people know who's...
Sure. Hi. My name's Michaela, and I guess I'm no longer an undergraduate student. I just finished my last classes at the University of Waterloo. So I have a Bachelor of Science in Health Studies, and I'm pursuing my master's degree in the fall. And I am a young caregiver. I provide care for 2 individuals in my family, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit.
Great, thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Oh, that's okay.
You can get me back later. Okay, so this is the basic outline of the first part of the presentation, which is the part that I'm going to be doing. We've already done the introductions. We can't see any of you, so unfortunately, you're not part of the introductions. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of a young carer. What is a young carer? And especially thinking about university students, sometimes they're referred to as young adult carers. Looking a little bit at young carers on campus, and then a thread that's going to run through both my presentation and Michaela's part is looking at how we can support young carers. And the really good news about this is that there are some actually relatively easy things that I think most people on this webinar will be able to implement that can actually make a huge difference to young carers' lives that you can do quite easily. So we're overall here with a positive message that you can actually make a huge difference starting this afternoon, if you'd like. So I want to begin, oh, that's me. There was the introduction slide. Yeah, so we can go beyond that. Thanks, Michaela. Michaela's going to share some of her experience, but I wanted to include a couple of quotes from some other young caregivers to give a sense of the range and the different kinds of experiences. And then we'll talk a little bit about the definition. So the 2 quotes that we're about to look at come from research on campuses at post-secondary institutions in Ontario. And there are a couple of descriptions from students attending classes about their caregiving experiences. So you can read along, and I'll also read this in case anyone wants to hear as well. So this first quote, the participant says, "When I was in high school, I was caring for my dad who has early onset Alzheimer's. When I think of all the things I've done for my dad, clean the house, do the laundry, cook meals, bathe and dress my dad, constantly check on him to make sure he had not wandered out of the house. I did all of these things in conjunction with schoolwork and a part-time job. I would say being a young caregiver has given me patience and understanding of others, but it has also left me with guilt and a sense of loss." So here's another example. "My grandmother had cancer and was fighting severe anxiety. I was up with her late at night and staying with her until she fell asleep. It prevented me from being fully and properly rested for school or completing my work to the best of my ability. There were negative effects of having to care for her, but it brought me closer to her." Thanks, Michaela. So when we talk about young carers or young caregivers, there are many different terms used, and there's different terms used in different jurisdictions. So one of the themes that you see a lot in work on young carers is that in Canada, we're actually very, very far behind other jurisdictions. So the term young carer is not familiar to us, whereas if we were in the UK or in Australia especially, or even in South Africa, the term young carer would be much more common. It would be a term that all of us already know. So definitions range a little bit. Most researchers define young carers as being under the age of 29, some under the age of 25. And young carers are people who provide unpaid care to a relative or a friend living with illness, disability, addiction, or injury. Those are the sort of key areas. And also aging-related illnesses. People often talk about that as another sort of category on its own. And the tasks that are performed by young caregivers range hugely. So it can be personal, physical, household, healthcare, communication tasks, emotional tasks. We see everything from people helping loved ones bathe and dress to helping with grocery shopping or translation work. So there's a huge range in the kinds of tasks that young carers perform. And often those change a lot in the life of a family as people's illnesses wax and wane, as people go through periods of relative health or relative illness. The kinds of work that young people do in their families will change over time. So shockingly, in Canada, we have an estimated 1.8 million young Canadians. So that's under the age of 24. So between the ages of, under the age of 24, who are estimated to be young carers. That comes from work that Vivian Stamatopoulos did a few years ago, looking at census data. And we actually don't know the actual number. In census data, there has been a question asking for people ages 15 to 24 to report on caregiving tasks. And so we know that there were about 1.25 million people in the, I think, 2012 census who reported on that. But the census did not ask for people under the age of 15. So it's a huge gap in our knowledge. We know that young carers are out there. We know that it is around getting close to the 2 million mark. So that is almost a third of young people in that age group who provide some sort of care for mostly loved ones, relatives, family members. The kinds of care that young people are providing look a lot like the kinds of care that people my age, middle-aged women, are providing for loved ones. So the majority support grandparents, about 40%. Next come parents, 27%. Friends and neighbors, and university students. There's also a lot supporting romantic partners as well. And then many young caregivers support their siblings or other extended family members. 19% support 3 or more people. So when we think about young carers, it's very often not just a young person providing care to one person. It's often a young person providing care to multiple people. And that's something that Michaela is going to talk about a little later in terms of her experience too. When I first learned this next statistic, I found it absolutely shocking. So the amount of time that young people who are age 15 to 24 spend providing care for others is the same as their middle-aged counterparts. So about the same number of hours, ranging from fairly light care to intensive caregiving of 30 hours or more. So it is a huge amount of time and a huge amount of energy. In Canada, we have no accommodations at many levels. So our focus today is on campuses, but even at the federal level. So the Compassionate Care Act, other legislation that we have is designed to protect workers who are generally middle-aged people. And there are not any federal level accommodations in Canada for young carers. It's quite different in other countries. So in the UK, there's the CARE Act. In England, Child and Families Act. Australia, Federal Young Care Bursary Program. And those are each designed to identify and support young carers. And those are national level programs. So there's wide recognition in those countries of young carers and lots of work being done to identify them and to support them through their studies and in their mental health and well-being. I didn't include a slide on South Africa, but South Africa is also ahead of us in Canada. Because of the AIDS crisis, South Africa has been faced with many child-headed households and has also had to contend with how to support children who are raising their siblings in particular. So there are also some national level programs in South Africa that work with young carers. So one of the things that's interesting when we talk to young caregivers is there are both benefits to young caregiving for many people and also some costs. So the benefits are really important to emphasize. We saw this a little bit with the two quotes that we began with, where people talk about being connected to loved ones and having an opportunity to have relationships on a deeper level. But there are some key benefits. So practical life skills. People who are young carers very often have been doing things that most kids don't for a really long time. So accessing services for themselves and their families. They may know how to navigate systems. They might be really confident in terms of being able to call for appointments or navigate transit. There's some real practical life skills that most young carers have, many in advance of their peers because they've had to take this on. There's often a real sense of pride and also a sense of self-efficacy. Many young carers are really proud of what they do and proud of being able to have a role that's meaningful in their families. We live in a culture where young people very often aren't valued for the work that they do and for making real contributions. We sort of emphasize that they will grow up and eventually make contributions. And young carers often prove to themselves every day that they are capable of doing really meaningful work that makes a difference for the people that they love. So there can be a real sense of pride in that. Also, we see heightened empathy and altruism. So young caregivers are people who very often have been practicing being able to empathize with other people, to be able to anticipate needs, to understand what people are thinking and feeling, especially if they have family members who aren't really able to express their feelings and needs. There's a lot of putting themselves in others' positions. So perspective taking, empathy skills, and a sense of altruism. And then another one that we see with with very many young caregivers, and we hear this all the time, is deeper connections with loved ones. Being able to be in a relationship where they contribute to their loved ones' well-being. And for many, that results in a really strong sense of connection. There is huge variation, though, in young caregivers' experiences. So we tend to define young caring as caregiving that is outside of the norm that is typically expected within one's culture. So it means there's a huge range. So some young caregivers will provide care that's quite light, so maybe help with grocery shopping, or if they're in an immigrant family where language skills, where English language skills are not there isn't fluency, then maybe with translation. And then at the opposite end is young caregivers who provide significant amounts of care, 30 hours or more potentially, who are helping with tasks like toileting and dressing, and who may have to drop out of school. So some of the work I do in different areas of my research is working with different communities. And I've been doing some research for or work with a community for the last few years in Nunavut. And a number of the young people I know in Nunavut have left school for a time to be able to provide care for family members, so have dropped out. And we also saw that when I was working in children's mental health, kids who weren't attending school because they were providing support for parents who needed them at home. So I should say it's something we see across the country in every community, every culture, and there are some cultural differences as well. I'll talk a little bit about those things more in a bit, but I wanted to emphasize to talk about the possible negative impacts of being a young carer. And this slide comes from a project that one of my students, Jess Boulay, did. I've actually borrowed her slide here. So we know that students who provide care are about 4 times more likely to drop out of post-secondary studies than their peers. And that comes from some research that was done in the UK. There's a range of problems that we see with many young carers. So chronic stress includes the stress of worrying about loved ones all the time. Sleep problems, sometimes they're needed around the clock, so their sleep is interrupted because someone needs them. Sometimes the sleep problems are related to anxiety. Eating problems, substance abuse problems, sometimes physical injuries for young people whose work with loved ones involves actually things like lifting or physical labor. Sometimes there's physical injuries as well. And then a range of psychological and educational effects. So for people here who I think are primarily coming from campus environments, from post-secondary institutions, things like poor attendance, dropping out, incomplete or poor quality assignments, limited participation in activities. So all of those great things that happen on campus, campus social lives, campus sports, campus activism, young carers don't necessarily have the time available to participate in those things. So in a university setting, as a professor, I know this, and I'm also actively involved in our campus inclusion work at the university level. Students can access accommodations for school work, for missing work, often because of illness, their own illness, or for compassionate reasons, for deaths of loved ones, things like that, or for religious reasons. Students who are young caregivers are typically not given accommodations because we don't even know that caregiving is a thing. So students who need accommodations because they have to take their mother to a doctor's appointment, or because they have to be home to care for a sibling because no one else is available. Those students may be given accommodations, but it's really up to the individual faculty member if the student feels comfortable asking. And a lot of young caregiving is hidden because there tends to be shame around it for many people, depending on the nature of the care work, and sometimes fear as well, especially with younger caregivers. There's often fear of disclosing because fear that child welfare services would become involved. So it's kept secret. Young carers are often not speaking up about it, but even when they do, and even if they ask for accommodations, very often they're not given those accommodations because we don't recognize young caregiving as a real thing in our society. It's also important to note that student caregivers often work while they're attending school. So for many young caregivers, their work involves personal care and looking after the health needs of loved ones, but it may also involve contributing to family income. So sometimes the work that they need to do isn't just to support themselves as students and support their post-secondary studies, but also to contribute to family income. So they may have even less time for schoolwork because of compounded work outside of the home, employment, as well as duties and tasks that they are needed to do inside the home. So we're not going to talk too much about this today. It's a newer area of research, but one thing I just wanted to point out is that we need to think about young caregiving within cultural contexts. So people from different backgrounds, different ethnic and cultural backgrounds in particular, will have different conceptions of family roles, of children's roles within the home, of gender roles. So that's something to be aware of, that young caring might mean different things in different groups, but also to think about unique sort of intersections of marginalization that come from racialization and other minority experiences. So that's something sort of just to put on your radar, that that's something to keep in mind. Also, because in our culture, care work is feminized, there tends to be less awareness of young male caregivers. So there's some different findings in research, whether how many more young women are engaging in care work versus young men. But we know that there are many, many male young carers out there, and very often they don't come forward because it's seen as women's work. And then young carers with learning difficulties is another area where there would be some additional risks and some sort of intersecting needs that would need to be taken into consideration when working with young carers.
Also, this is my part of the presentation. So I just wanted to kind of give you a narrative of my experience. So this is me. I'm Michaela. And as I stated before, I just finished my undergrad and I'm pursuing my master's degree in the fall at the University of Waterloo, and I'm very excited. But I'm also a young caregiver to my sister, who has a rare neurological condition called complex regional pain syndrome. And this condition causes extreme constant pain from normal sensations like touch or wind. And I'm going to dive into a bit of a story about my experience. It's not pretty and it's rather difficult to talk about, but it's very important to. During my second and third year of university, my life turned into absolute chaos. And usually when I tell this story, I only talk about my sister because I'm afraid that if I explained everything, people wouldn't believe me or they think that I'm exaggerating. But today I will expand because I think it's important to appreciate that when it rains, it pours, and that when a student is struggling, there's often a very deep trajectory that remains unseen. So here is what happened. In approximately the span of 12 months, while trying to keep my grades up, pursuing co-op jobs, and working part-time, my sister's condition accelerated at an alarming rate. Her disease moved from her left leg into her right leg and upper back. She went from predominantly using crutches to move around to using a wheelchair after she fell. And her medications that she was prescribed for her pain were making her vomit constantly, and she didn't want to live anymore. At the same time, my other sister experienced a pretty nasty concussion, which ultimately left her occasional migraines to occur regularly. And we, in the process of diagnosis to figure out what was going on, we found out that she had a whole bunch of brain cysts. My father lost his job, and I was in a very toxic relationship. Both of my sisters contemplated suicide. My father was depressed, and my mother was trying to hold our family together. So I'm sure, as you can see how emotional I am right now, that it was a very stressful time of my life. And I hit rock bottom. I wasn't coping. I started having panic attacks daily, and I lost a lot of weight. I don't know if you've ever experienced an anxiety attack before, but essentially your entire body feels like it's shaking and you're vibrating. So in order to stop that feeling, I would dig my nails into my forearms until they broke skin. And the stress took a toll on my immune system, and so I was constantly sick. And you can take a look at my transcript. You can see exactly when I was struggling. It's reflected in my grades and the fact that I withdrew from the class, because that's not who I am. I would have persevered and I would have stuck it out if I could have. I ended up losing friendships because they couldn't see what I was going through. And they saw an erratic behavior and they didn't want to deal with it. When you go through stress like that, you lose all sense of control in your life. You live in a world of unknowns. It doesn't matter how much you plan ahead to be successful, because things happen in a split second that dismantle everything. You just grasp at the strings and hold on as best you can. I managed to get through this period of my life through sheer luck, tenacity, and my own stubbornness. I was lucky enough to find support in my workplace. I worked for the Murray Alzheimer's Research and Education Program, and they had an initiative that supported young caregivers. And it was one of the first in Canada. And I had two amazing coworkers who understood what I was going through and offered me support. I was invited to the first Young Carers Forum at the Change Foundation, which was the first time I felt recognized and validated for my role. I managed to figure out how to get myself back through creating a very supportive structure for myself. I hired a personal trainer to keep me active and accountable, which was fundamental for my mental health. And I learned that taking a step back to care for myself first was not only okay, but necessary. So who am I now? I guess since then I've worked hard to become recognized as someone who is dedicated to making change and building awareness of young caregivers and supports. I finished my degree and I'm pursuing graduate studies. Young caregiving has made me resilient and persistent and stronger than I ever thought I was, but it also has very real consequences. I will miss out on potential scholarships because of the dip crisis caused in my grades. I missed out on a number of opportunities and volunteering because of the time I committed to making sure my family was okay. I have always been a high-achieving student, and I persevered through the tough times, but that is not the reality of many others. Student caregivers, without support from professors, from universities, from policy and legislation and institutions, they will remain unseen and fall through the cracks. Many already have. So that's my spiel, and I wanted to open it up a little bit so I can answer questions, and I also wanted to start a discussion on how us as a society and professionals in universities can support young caregivers. So there's a couple of questions up on the slide about how, just to think about, how can you make it easier for students to just disclose that they are giving care to a loved one? How can you provide opportunities for support? And how can you foster well-being approaches for these students?
So I guess at this point, we're just going to open it up. Is that what you had in mind, Michaela?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get the ball rolling. I would actually like to, well, thank you, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think that was very moving, and I think that really gives an insight as to what young caregivers might be struggling with. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.
But I would also like to start the ball rolling with what in both of your opinions, Michaela and Andrea, for these three questions that you've posed, what are your thoughts on it? What could campuses do?
Well, we actually have ideas. So we were interested in seeing if other people had ideas first.
Okay.
We can do it either way. We can jump ahead to ours. Or we can, I'm not sure, this for both Michaela and I, this is our first webinar with this, so we're not sure what is typically done. But if people are happy to address these questions, that's great. If not, we can keep rolling. We have a little bit more presentation that we do want to get through as well.
Okay, so well, I guess we'll just give it a couple of minutes, see if there's anything that anyone wants to raise. So just for everyone in our audience who's watching the webinar, if you want to share your thoughts on any of these discussion questions, please use that question function and type it up, and then we'll take it away from there. Well, we have a bunch of stuff rolling in actually all at once. Someone suggested creating a group on campus that supports caregivers.
Yeah.
Somebody else suggested including the concept of young carers in information regarding accessible learning, wellness, and campus support in general. Just the inclusion of the term would be helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And someone else has said, I am also a young carer at the University of Toronto. I feel that accessibility services should provide accommodations for young carers. Another suggestion is encouraging staff and faculty to look for changes in students' habits and grades to identify students that they may want to reach out to or refer.
One of the issues maybe with having professors see dips in grades like that is because you're there for a very short period of time. You're only there for 4 months. With a certain professor usually, and you might not catch that.
That's true. The semester is only 4 months long.
It would really depend on the program and relationship. In some programs, students do work with specific professors throughout their university experience, off and on. So there would be people who would know if something is changing. But it's true, very often we have students just for a semester and we don't know who they were before, what's normal for them. So yeah, that one is challenging, but depending on the environment, that absolutely could work.
Yeah. Another suggestion is that the family office on campus could have additional support for young carers. And last one is actually a question. Are the mental health counselors on campus usually supportive and understanding? What's been your experience?
I don't think they know what a young carer is. The term isn't used very often. So they don't really know what to do with that population. I personally haven't accessed anybody on university campus or at UW's campus because I don't live near the campus. It didn't make sense for me. But we don't have a great rep for our mental health and counseling services. There's huge wait lists and it'll take months to even see somebody. So yeah.
I think it's been a long time since I had an experience as a student on campus with mental health services, but as a faculty person who's interacted a lot with our on-campus mental health supports, my impression is that yes, absolutely, they are supportive. And when we do talk here at Guelph about young carers, people are very interested in learning more. I think it is, as Michaela said, people just aren't used to thinking about it. And in some ways, it gets at deeper issues of how we approach mental health. So in Western culture, mental health tends to still be approached from an individual perspective. So you have an individual who's seeking care, and especially on campus, in campus environments. We don't usually think of the student who's in front of us as part of a family, as part of a community, and that their own mental health is, inextricably linked to the health and well-being of the people they're with. So we're not used to asking about people's family relationships in terms of who else they're caring for. It's the same, similar with student parents on campus. A lot of the issues that young carers face are similar to students who have children who go to school. So yes, I think a lot of it has to do with just building awareness and also thinking of mental health differently a little bit, like thinking about it as not just an individual, but as an individual who's embedded in relationships that they're carrying with them into your office.
Yeah.
One of the things we're struggling with, so one of the first things you mentioned was having a peer support group on campus. One of the things that we've tried to initiate that at UW, but people aren't self-identifying themselves because the term is so new and under-recognized. So people don't, like, I didn't think I was a young carer until I was working for an organization that supported them. And then I was hit in the face with the fact that I was. But yeah, so that's one of the problems we're having with peer support networks is they're not, people are just not self-identifying.
Yeah, we find that here too. So it's creating groups is a fantastic idea, and absolutely. There's actually research looking at why young carers don't identify with labels. So whether it's young carers, young adult carers, caregivers, very often people just look at their work within families as part of being a good daughter or being a good sister. So that caregiver role or the term is not something that people self-identify with easily, even when it fits. So in research right now, a group of us at University of Guelph and Brock University, University of Ontario Technology, and also UBC are starting some new research on caregiving, young carers. And looking at young carers transitioning to university. And the first kind of issue is how to identify people for research, or how to have people self-identify, because using the term young carer often doesn't work terribly well because people don't see themselves in it.
That's true. Terminology is very important. And I think just that term caregiver is very specific, and if you think of yourself, if you're a caregiver, you think of yourself as just providing support. You don't necessarily think yourself as having that term caregiver attached to you.
Right. Yeah. A good granddaughter, grandson. What does it mean to be a daughter? So when you start asking people about their relationships, you can start to find more. But some people, and so yes, so we are advocating for a term because it makes a huge difference in terms of support and recognition. So absolutely use the term, but also with the recognition that even if you start using the term, which is important, there will be people missed as you're using it.
Of course, yeah. Another question actually is this issue of caregiving not addressed in the legislation regarding disabilities, the AODA? No?
Not at all. Not in Canada.
It's very interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
We're fighting for it right now. There are people fighting for recognition through legislation because in research in the UK and I think Australia, I could be wrong, they've seen that organizations, they don't take the initiative to support this population until there is mandated legislation, and then changes start to happen. So there are people fighting for it right now in Canada, but it's a slow process.
And it should be protected under human rights legislation as well. So in Canada, discrimination for family status is recognized, but there has never been precedent for young caregivers. So our caregiving legislation, also our protections are really designed with workers in mind, middle-aged workers. And so we just haven't had the shift in awareness to recognize that we need to actually expand these things to young people as well.
Yeah. Michaela, I have a question for you actually. When your grades were suffering and you were going through the peak of your struggles, did you try to reach out to your professors and request extensions for assignments, and if so, were you denied?
I've had some mixed results in that. I disclosed my situation in a paper to one of my professors, and I was told that my reflection was lengthy and unnecessary. And so that was a negative experience.
Yeah.
But I've also had really great experiences. This past term, unfortunately, I had to take my sister to the hospital in the middle of the night, and I emailed my professor at 1 a.m. asking if I could continue to do the work because we had an in-class project that day, but I didn't know when or if we were going to leave that hospital that day. And she was more than understanding and accommodating. But it really depends on the individual. I honestly think that sensitivity training would be really helpful for TAs and lecturers, just so that they understand that, I guess, beyond what they read on a paper, that people are people and we experience hardship sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Michaela. I think there's a lot of the what we read about young people, and there's all these like millennials are lazy and young people today don't, and as a professor who works really closely with students, I actually think the opposite. When you start looking at students' lives and all that they're carrying, there is incredible strength, and usually, almost always, there's very good reasons for students not being able to show up and do the things that you ask. So yeah, I think a closer look and a shift in that kind of stereotype that older generations always have of young people as being, lazy or whatever it is, negative stereotypes.
Yeah. We do have a couple more comments on the discussion. So did you want to just go through that and move on? Because I know you have a couple more slides you mentioned.
Yeah, we just have a couple more.
Okay, yes, I wasn't sure how the timing would work out.
That's great. Yeah, so we'll continue, and then maybe we can have some more discussion at the end. I think that would work really well.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Michaela, do you mind advancing to the next one?
Oh, that's my job. Sorry.
Yeah. So we wanted to open it up to you because we knew that the audience, that the participants today would actually be able to come up with these ideas on your own as well, because it really isn't rocket science. And a lot of the ideas that you've just mentioned are exactly what needs to happen. So we made this, Michaela and I made this into three really simple things that we think are, take home, 3 things that you can do starting this afternoon if you'd like. And it's ask, advocate, and accommodate, and they're interrelated. So the first thing is really to ask, like if you have, you're in a counseling relationship or you're a faculty member, whatever it is, to not be afraid to ask people whether they provide care and support. So this question is, as it's worded, comes from research or an article by Chadi and Vivian Stamatopoulos. And so this wording, if it's helpful, that they suggest is, do you provide support or care for a family member or loved one, either in or outside your home? And what we find, even in classes when I talk about this and I ask, is that in every single class, there are multiple students who will answer absolutely to this. And I expect in a day of providing services as a mental health support person, counselor, whatever your role is, you will have people in your office absolutely who would be young caregivers. I expect pretty much every day. So asking is the first thing to kind of bring it to light. And then the ideas that people came up with were great. So advocate, so campus inclusion policies, we look at inclusion in different ways. We look at inclusion based on, LGBTQ plus status, gender identity. We look at inclusion based on disabilities and racialization. We need to also look at inclusion based on people's family responsibilities. So when we're thinking about inclusion in academic life, in both school, like classes, research, also in student life, we need to think about young carers in those things. And the idea of a support group or a group of young carers to support each other on campus is a fantastic idea. The other thing is to raise awareness. So to go off today in your working life and family life and to talk about young carers and young caregivers so that people are aware of this. We have millions of young people around us in our country who are in this role. And the more people start to talk about it, the more we'll be able to raise awareness and have people access supports. And then the big thing that also came up in your questions or your recommendations was supporting academic accommodations, getting that language onto syllabi, course outlines, and to doing whatever you can to support students in actually being able to get accommodations for missed assignments or extensions, whatever it is. But to take young caregiving seriously so that that becomes part of one of the things that we expect students can be successful at asking for accommodations for. That was a terrible sentence. So hopefully people understood what I mean, but helping students to be able to access accommodations successfully. So this, there's a few resources that I just want to highlight. This was put together by a student of mine a few years ago, Jess Boulay, and it's available from the link. So I taught a class a few years ago for graduate students, actually 2 years ago, on knowledge translation, and a few of the students were really interested in young caregivers. So they did a really great job of looking at all the research that exists on young carers in Canada, but especially in Australia and the UK, and put together a guide for post-secondary institutions. So that is available at the Guelph Atrium, and hopefully there will be some helpful things in there for people who would like to read more. And if you can keep going, Michaela, I'll just finish up, just describe, and then there's resources and reading. So the statistics that I talked about come from Vivian Stamatopoulos's work. That resource will be on the next slide, and there's a few things. So I've included a mix of original research articles and also reports that have been done that give an overview of young carers in Canada, abroad, and some strategies for supporting young carers. And then there's just one more slide after this, just so you get a sense of it. Oh. It's over. The Change Foundation is highlighted there, and they, in Ontario, are doing work right now. They've been doing lots of work, actually, to identify programs that support young caregivers. Until very recently, we thought there were only 3 in the country that explicitly provide support to young carers, and about 3 to 5 researchers doing any kind of work in this area. The Change Foundation has identified more and are doing compiling an ongoing list of programs and services that support young carers. So there still are very few programs and supports that use the term young carers and are specifically targeted to young carers, but there are many supports and services available for people who provide care for siblings or parents in different organizations. So they've done some digging to compile a larger list. And then a support guide is the last thing, the Young Carers Project. Support Matters, a guide for young carers and their allies, which I think Michaela's group there was involved in developing.
I came in after this project, so I can't take any credit, but it is a really great booklet that does a great job at outlining how individuals in the community can support people like me and others like me.
Great. So I think we can open it up again if there are any additional questions or comments.
Yeah, so we did have a couple overflow from just now, but before we jump into questions, I just want to quickly do this poll because we were interested in understanding how many of you were doing this as a lunch and learn sort of exercise, and how many were just kind of watching it yourself. So there's a poll that's going to come up on the screen right now. I will close it in just in a little bit. And while people are working away on that, I just want to thank both of you so much for your presentation. I think this was very eye-opening. as you mentioned just now in your talks, I think the idea of young caregivers isn't necessarily something that has trickled into the sort of university and college system of supports, and that, oh, this is something that we need to be keeping an eye out, but this is really great information.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to close the poll right now. Just, oh, I don't know if you two can see it. We just wanted to just take a quick overview and see how many people were doing as lunch and learn sort of thing. All right, anyways, back to the questions. So let me just pull that up right now. Okay, we have a number of questions that have come out. One of it is, would it not be more effective to support academic accommodations at the onset, for example, at the registration process, to ensure consistency from one faculty member to the other? This could possibly be done as a section on the registration forms. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, and in fact, some universities in England are doing exactly that. So asking people to identify an initial registration when they're coming in, and then the universities are obligated to provide supports. But absolutely, I think that would be the ideal sort of thing to move towards.
I wonder how we could also incorporate people who become young caregivers in their university careers as well, because they wouldn't self-identify at the onset.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And I think in the university population, there's also some differences, and it's there isn't a ton of research yet on young carers in post-secondary institutions. So the research that we're starting to do now is going to be pretty much the first in Canada. Heather Chalmers has done a little bit, and she's part of our group as well. So yes, there's students who become young carers during the experience. That's very common. There's also different kinds of caregiving. So it shifts to people also provide care for friends, roommates, romantic partners. That's a difference for the sort of post-secondary age group compared to young carers. And then we also see students providing care at a distance. So supporting families still, even if you move away from home, there's still support. There's lots of students who go home on weekends and spend their entire weekend supporting family members and then return to campus during the week. So it looks a little bit different for university students, but it also does shift over time. And people's health status changes over time. So what caregiving looks like at registration might be really different from what it looks like even 2 or 3 months later. So I think it's a great solution, but I think there also needs to be kind of ongoing recognition of change and fluctuation.
Absolutely, people's situations change. Are there any online support groups for young carers right now?
I tried to make one once. One of the problems that we ran into was that people just don't have the time to reach out to have a peer network like that, because they are providing care, a lot of care, and also have a lot of other responsibilities on top of it. So what we found, at least in my experience, is the more helpful thing was offering us a project to do that kind of had a dual role in offering support to one another. So peer support, like I'm part of the Young Carers project in Kitchener-Waterloo, and that has given me an advocacy role and actively involved in trying to create supports for young carers, but it's also given me opportunity to meet people like me. And we don't necessarily engage in a formal level offering support, but on a friendship level that has developed over time, and it's been really great.
That's a really good question about online supports and what exists. There's lots of talk of doing those sorts of things, and to be honest, there was a lot of talk about it about 1.5 years ago, and I'm not quite sure if things have developed and I'm just not on top of it. There probably is in the UK. I have a feeling there is. I know Powerhouse Project in St. Catharines, which has been an absolute leader in young carers work in the country. They were the first organization to get involved in this work, and they're incredible at it. They're talking about developing online supports. I know the Change Foundation, some of the participants in the forum were talking about that being another area to focus on, to develop ways of connecting young carers across the country. And then some other ideas that we've discussed is things like even just building in awareness for existing support. So things like the Kids Help phone, which exists nationally. There's a need to develop awareness with groups like that are already kind of well positioned to provide support and could add on where awareness of young carers could be built into what they're already doing. So there's lots of work to be done, but I can't say for sure that nothing along those lines exists yet, because there has been some stuff in development.
Thank you. So we just have a few more questions and comments. Actually, someone from the Mental Health Commission is watching the webinar right now, and I'm not sure if you've heard about the student mental health standards that they're developing. So they said that, that I've learned so much from this. At the Mental Health Commission, we are developing a student standard for mental health, and we will need to include the young care and accommodations needs into the standard for all post-secondary institutions.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing person. We love you.
And also we have some staff from the Alzheimer's Society in Peel, and it says thank you very much for the seminar. It's very eye-opening for the young care population.
Yeah, and the Alzheimer's community, the Alzheimer's support in Toronto, I think, is the group that was also really involved early on in recognizing this. So especially with early onset Alzheimer's, there's a lot of young people supporting family members from a young age and for many, many years. So that's a really key group. Thanks.
I'm going to do a shameless plug for my coworker and friend who is in a documentary called Much Too Young, and she is a young caregiver for her mother who has dementia. And it is one of the best documentaries that I have seen encompassing young caregivers and their experiences. So if you have a chance, it's on TVO, and you can just stream it online. It's a really good documentary.
What is it called? Sorry?
Much Too Young.
Much Too Young. Okay, I will add that to my watch list.
Yeah. I'm also going to do a shameless plug, perhaps a little more shameless. We're right now recruiting participants. So we're doing new research funded by SHIRK to look at young carers who provide care for parents who are living with chronic illness. So we're recruiting young people in their last year of high school and their parents, and we're going to look at their experiences over about a year as the young person is transitioning out of high school, and look at how they negotiate care, but also the impacts in terms of the relationship for both the parent and the young carer. So it's parents living with chronic illness and their students in high school, or their children in high school who are just finishing. So if anyone knows, if anyone is interested in that or thinks you may have some people who may be interested in participating, please get in touch.
That's great. We certainly need more research done in the area. So I think that sums up all the questions that we've had, unless we have any last minute things. But is there any final thoughts that both of you want to share?
Well, thank you for having us. I think this has been a great platform for us to kind of share something very dear and near to my heart. And hopefully we can create more supports and change so we can better support our student population.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciated this opportunity to talk about it. So thank you, Perlin and Michaela. It's great to have this chance to be here with you. And if anyone's interested or has follow-up questions, I'm here at the University of Guelph. My email address, maybe we can make that available, but it's abreen@uofguelph.ca, and I'm happy to ask, for people to get in touch if they have questions or want to talk more about collaborations or anything along those lines.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for presenting us today. It was really good information about a group that's, not whose needs are not being met and that hasn't really been highlighted in the past. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. So watch out for the follow-up email that's going to come tomorrow, and that's going to have the recording of this webinar. That's going to also have the slides and everything. And don't forget the survey that is going to pop up in the end of the webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.